Okay, welcome to my first Q&A video. Here we go. I'm thinking about getting a bass. What basses should I start looking for? My advice to you would be to try and find an affordable Fender P bass or jazz bass and find one that has a good neck, feels good, seems sturdy, and the electronics sound okay, and just start there. You don't need to spend a lot of money to get a good bass sound, or at least a good bass sound to start with. You can always modify the pickups, make it sound a little better. You can modify a cheap bass and make it sound awesome. Some of my favorite sounding basses through the years have been not expensive basses. So yeah, I would say find a passive Fender that feels good, and maybe that's its own video. Maybe we'll do a bass build at some point. Let me know if you're interested in that. But yeah, look for a cheap Fender that feels good and just start there. What's your favorite bass effect pedal and why? Bass effects, I don't use a ton of effects. I usually keep my tone pretty clean, so it'll probably be something to do with giving me some saturation and texture to sit into the mix. Right now I would go with this pedal, which is the Germanium Boost Brennan Cuffs Fat Fuck for bass. It's the pink one. I really like it. It's a nice texture, nice saturation, nice harmonics, simple, straightforward pedal. I really like that one. Next question. What is a piece of gear that you regret getting rid of? I sold my Ready last year. Ready standing for Red DI. It's, if you're not familiar with it, it's a big, awesome tube direct box. I had that thing for years. I sold it this past year when money was tight, and I miss it. Any basses that just ain't for you. I'm like that with most active basses. I would agree with you. I have played active basses in the past, just not my vibe. I really like passive basses. Nothing wrong with active basses, just not really my thing. So every once in a while, like Sadowski, I really like their preamps. But yeah, I just prefer that passive sound in general. Would you like to make a solo album? Yes and no. I don't want to make a bass solo album. I do like arranging music, and I could see releasing some of the music that I'm creating. I did create an album a couple years ago that I'm really proud of. It's called Kudzu Hill. It's actually it's an album, but it's also a short story that I wrote, a science fiction short story that I scored and recorded with the help of a bunch of my friends. So if you're interested in checking it out, I'll put a link in the description. It's something that I'm really proud of and I'm really glad to have made, and I'm hoping that I can make some more stuff like that in the future. What do you like more, working in the studio or live? Really tough question. I think I would say either or, depending on when you ask me. In the studio, I'd probably say in the studio, because I love creating a moment. You're out of time in the studio. You can try something as many times as you want, but you're trying to find a perfect thing. But when you're playing live, that moment is passing and it's gone. So I think live is like very precious and very finite, and it's only there in that moment. That's really cool. But the studio is cool because you can immortalize whatever you want. So if you ask me in the studio, I'd probably say studio. If you ask me right after I walked off stage, I'd probably say live. So both for different reasons, I guess. Do you think learning other instruments as a bass player is important? Yes, I think that's going to help you a lot. I think mainly understanding the different roles in the ensemble, like knowing what the drummer's doing, knowing what the keyboard player's doing, knowing what the guitar player's doing, will help you to know where to fit. As a bass player, I like to listen to everyone else and then try and come up with the idea that will make them all sound even better. I'm not saying you have to be a master of every instrument. I'm not saying you have to study every instrument really in depth, but at least having an understanding of what they're doing and knowing how to listen to everyone else is going to absolutely help you be a better bass player. Next question. I'm a guitarist, drummer, and want to start playing bass. Looking for any sort of advice. Where do I start? What are things to avoid? What are some exercises to practice? Really good question. You have a huge advantage, because I think the bass is somewhere in between the drums and the guitar already. You're taking the drums and you're taking the pulse of the drums and the rhythm and the heartbeat, and you're combining the harmonic content and the similarities with guitar. So you already have a huge advantage over a lot of people that are wanting to learn bass because you understand those other roles. I think, I don't want to go too in depth with exercises in this video, but I would say listen to great bass lines, try and pick them out by ear and start to play along. Practice, I think practice listening is huge. Start getting used to listening to bass lines and trying to recreate them, and you're going to start to find your voice if you are connecting with bass lines that you think are cool and inspire you. The next question. For how long have you known Rhett Schull? I've known Rhett for probably 10 years or so. We went to school together, and then we played in a bunch of different bands together through the years. Rhett is a very, very good friend of mine. So yeah, known him for a while. Bass distortion while lining out to front of house. Sounds real fizzy in the highs. Can't make up my mind if it's good. Hard to say without hearing what you're talking about. I would say trust your ears. If you're not sure if it sounds good, it probably doesn't. So go with your gut. And if you feel like any effect that you're using may be hindering your overall sound, then just go without. There's no rules, but I think keeping it simple is never a bad thing. Next question. Using a compressor live, I always get the best sound turning it off. Turn it off if you think it sounds best off. Trust your ears. I think it is important to note there are at least two main ways to use compression. One is to tame your dynamics, so making your loud notes a little softer, your softer notes seem a little louder, and just smooth things out. You can also use compression in a more creative way to create a artistic effect. By changing the different settings, you can squish your sound in different ways to create a different feeling. So I'm not going to go too much into either of those, but I will say the more you squish something or sculpt something using compression or EQ, the more you are boxing in your front of house engineer. Your bass sound might sound very different on stage or in your ears than it does at the middle of the club or in the middle of the venue where the front of house engineer is listening. And I think you need to trust your front of house engineer to do their job in the same way they're trusting you to do your job. So I try to leave space for them to work, meaning if I am going to use EQ or compression, not using it too much to give them some space. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, next question. What gear do you bring to a session? Basses, amps, DI, preamp chain, utility stuff, etc. Good question. Depends on the session. Depends on your relationship with the producer or the artist. I will usually bring several basses. I will bring a tube amplifier. I will bring some pedal options, multiple types of strings. I guess I'll get a little more specific. I'll bring my P bass. I usually keep flats on it, but I bring rounds too. I usually bring my jazz bass. I keep rounds on that if I want a bright sound. I bring semi-hollow bass, which is kind of a secret weapon in the studio. Might do a whole video on that at some point. I'll bring the Mustang. I bring the Ampeg B15 flip top. I'll bring a few pedal options. Always bring a direct box, and also leave your ego at home. You need to be easy to work with. You need to be willing to talk and compromise with the producer for their vision. Even if what you're playing or the tone that you have in mind for a song isn't what the producer thinks is right for the song, you have to yield to their vision. So yeah, it just depends. But I think bring options and be willing to pivot and hope for the best. Which videos are the most fulfilling to make? I really like making, I like making all of them for different reasons. I'm really passionate about making some of these sound experiments and creative videos I've been making recently where I'll write music and show you the process. But I also find a lot of fulfillment in the fact that some of these educational based videos are hopefully helpful for people. I'd be curious what you think. I feel like this channel is still very young, and it could go in a couple different directions. More bass, informative, educational, technical nuts and bolts sort of things, or these sort of creative sound experiments I've been doing. I'm curious which of these types of videos you're connecting with and or finding helpful. So please let me know. But I really love making these videos for you, and I hope that you're finding them inspiring or helpful. When you write songs, do you usually start on piano, like with the tiny songs? A lot of times, yes. I'll start with piano and I'll find either a chord progression that I find inspiring or a melody that gets stuck in my head, and then I'll build outward from there. Or I'll start with a bass line. Or I also really like helping other people finish their songs. So if a friend of mine has an idea, a musical idea, I like to try and help build the arrangement out from there. So it really depends. But if it's just me, typically nowadays I find myself sitting down at the piano, finding something that I find interesting, be that a chord progression or a melody, and then build out from there. What type of amp do you use when performing? Video on the different amp options. That's a good question. That would be a cool video to do. Stay tuned. Maybe we'll do an amp video soon. To answer your question though, I am currently using, and for a long time, I have been using Thunderfunk 750. Thunderfunk is a small company. There's a guy that hand makes these amplifiers, and they're really powerful. They're very clean. They're very reliable. And I'm using Aguilar cabs. I'm using two 12s. I like 12s because they have a lot of low end, but they also have clarity. Tone-wise, they're between a 10-inch speaker and a 15-inch speaker. And I really like that sound. It's been really reliable for me for a long time. And however, I should say too, I'm mostly using this as a glorified stage monitor. Most of my sound that people out front are hearing is coming from my pedal board on XLR out. So you don't always have the luxury of miking up your cab. So a lot of times your stage rig is more of a stage monitor for yourself. But I do really like that sound, and that's been good for me for a while. In the studio, I use the Ampeg B15 flip top and use that for more saturation, but it just depends on the gig. Should I change my bass strings? They're 8 years old. That's a funny question, Rhett. You know what? Leave them on there forever. I kind of like to think of strings like shoes. You know, if you wore the same pair of shoes every day, they would wear out a lot faster. But if you have a few different pairs of shoes, or you don't wear a certain pair of shoes a lot, they'll last a longer time. So I think there's nothing wrong with leaving the same set of bass strings on your bass forever, if you are happy with that sound. I think broken in strings sound really good. I don't particularly like brand new sounding strings, but you can always boil your strings if you want a cleaner, brighter sound. I should say your strings will break. It doesn't happen a lot, but it will happen when it's the least convenient time. So I think it's important to always keep some spares with you, and I would also encourage you to break in those spares. So let's say if you had 8-year-old bass strings on and you broke a string and you changed your strings mid-gig, anytime you played that new string, your bass sound would change a lot. It'd be a lot brighter and crisper, and it would your sound would be inconsistent. So I think it is wise to have extra strings with you that are already broken in, just in case. What's it like being married to a woman who is also a creative? I'm very lucky. My wife Shay is an amazing artist, and it's really helpful having her for so many reasons, but to bounce ideas off of, and to collaborate with, and to get advice from is really cool. And it's been cool to see her do her thing and grow as an artist. And yeah, I think creative people being together is a very cool thing. It makes the whole process really fun. What do you use to film and edit your videos? I'm editing everything in Pro Premiere, and then to film everything, I am using my iPhone. And I'm really hoping to get a real camera soon. So if you could subscribe, that would really help me out, because once I get a certain number of subscribers, I can justify buying a real camera, which would help me make better videos and would help me make the videos faster. So yeah, I think you can do cool things with an iPhone, but I'm really excited to hopefully get a real camera soon. So I got so many questions in my poll, and they're really good questions. So I've decided to split this into a part 1, part 2. So if I didn't get to your question today, there's a good chance I'll get to it next week. So please stay tuned. And also, I just want to say thanks. This channel is very young. I've been at this for about a month, and we're about at 800 subscribers, which is huge. And that's thanks to you. I could not do any of this without you. And also, this Q&A video has been really cool because I don't even know who's out there, who's listening. And seeing all these questions is like, man, there's some really awesome people out there in the internet that have, somehow found this small channel and are engaged and are asking questions. And it's exciting to starting to see a little bit of communities, which I'm really hoping will continue to grow. So thanks for being here, and I'll see you next week.